Pearl Harbor began as an attempt to combine one of the most famous events in American history with the scale, spectacle, romance, and emotional accessibility of a major Hollywood blockbuster. Released in 2001, the film was produced by Jerry Bruckheimer and directed by Michael Bay, with a screenplay by Randall Wallace. Although the finished movie tells a fictional story centered on two American pilots and a nurse caught in the events surrounding the attack on Pearl Harbor, the project was rooted in a real historical tragedy that had already been explored in documentaries, books, newsreels, and earlier dramatic films. The challenge facing the filmmakers was therefore not simply to retell history. Their goal was to create a version of the story that could introduce the events of December 7th, 1941, to a new generation while delivering the kind of large-scale entertainment associated with the blockbuster filmmaking of the late 1990s and early 2000s. The basic idea behind the project emerged from a broader interest in creating an epic World War II romance with the production values of a modern action film. Jerry Bruckheimer had become one of Hollywood's most successful producers by specializing in high-concept entertainment built around spectacle, strong emotional stakes, music, action, and visually striking imagery. His earlier collaborations with Michael Bay, including Bad Boys, The Rock, and Armageddon, had established a recognizable filmmaking partnership. Their films were designed to feel large, energetic, dramatic, and cinematic. Pearl Harbor represented an opportunity to apply that approach to historical material. The project also arrived at an important moment in the history of Hollywood. In the years leading up to the release of Pearl Harbor, studios were increasingly willing to invest enormous budgets in event movies. Titanic had demonstrated that a historical disaster film combined with a sweeping romance could become a worldwide cultural phenomenon. Saving Private Ryan had shown that World War II could be presented to modern audiences with an unprecedented sense of technical realism and emotional intensity. These films helped prove that audiences were willing to embrace large-scale historical dramas when the spectacle was supported by personal stories. Pearl Harbor was developed within this environment, but its creators chose a distinctly different tone from either film. Instead of focusing primarily on the brutality of combat or pursuing a tragic romance in the style of a period melodrama, the filmmakers attempted to combine romance, friendship, action, patriotism, disaster spectacle, and military adventure into one massive narrative. Unlike a traditional adaptation, Pearl Harbor was not based on a single novel, biography, or historical work. The source material was history itself. The attack on Pearl Harbor was one of the defining events of the 20th century, bringing the United States directly into World War II and transforming American military, political, and cultural life. The film therefore had access to a vast collection of historical events, real people, military records, memoirs, photographs, and previous interpretations. However, the central love triangle involving Rafe McCawley, Danny Walker, and Evelyn Johnson was fictional. This fictional storyline gave the filmmakers a way to personalize the historical events. This decision was crucial to the film's development. A purely historical retelling would have required the audience to follow a large number of military commanders, political figures, Japanese officers, sailors, pilots, nurses, and government officials. That could have produced an accurate but emotionally distant experience for a mainstream audience. By placing fictional characters at the center, the screenplay created an emotional bridge between viewers and the historical setting. The audience could experience the larger events through the friendship between Rafe and Danny and through their relationships with Evelyn. The screenplay was written by Randall Wallace, a writer known for combining historical or heroic settings with emotionally direct storytelling. Wallace had previously gained major recognition for writing Braveheart, another film that transformed historical material into a sweeping and highly dramatic cinematic narrative. His approach to Pearl Harbor reflected a similar interest in combining historical events with fictionalized personal stories. The goal was not to create a documentary reconstruction. Instead, the screenplay used history as the enormous stage upon which a melodramatic story of friendship, love, loss, sacrifice, and duty could unfold. The fictional relationship between Rafe, Danny, and Evelyn became the structural foundation of the screenplay. Rafe and Danny are introduced as lifelong friends who share a passion for flying. Their friendship provides the story with a strong emotional core before the larger historical events arrive. Evelyn then becomes the third point of the central triangle. Her romance with Rafe develops just as the threat of war begins to reshape their lives. When Rafe leaves to join the Eagle Squadron and is believed to have been killed, Danny and Evelyn gradually form a relationship of their own. This creates a personal conflict that exists independently of the war. By the time the attack on Pearl Harbor occurs, the characters are already dealing with emotional wounds and divided loyalties. This structure allowed the screenplay to operate on several levels at once. On one level, Pearl Harbor is a historical disaster film. The audience knows that an attack is coming, even if the fictional characters do not fully understand the danger. On another level, it is a romantic melodrama centered on love, grief, and betrayal. At the same time, it is a friendship story about two men whose relationship is tested by circumstances beyond their control. Finally, it becomes a military action film in which the surviving characters move from victims of an attack to participants in America's response. The decision to build the story around a love triangle was one of the most controversial creative choices made during development and after the film's release. For the filmmakers, however, it served an important commercial and dramatic purpose. A film focused entirely on military strategy might attract viewers interested in war history, but could risk narrowing its audience. Michael Bay's vision for Pearl Harbor was shaped by a combination of historical spectacle, emotional melodrama, kinetic action filmmaking, and the belief that cinema should be experienced on the largest possible scale. By the time Pearl Harbor entered production, Bay had already established himself as one of the most visually recognizable directors in Hollywood. His earlier films, including Bad Boys, The Rock, and Armageddon, had demonstrated a consistent approach to filmmaking built around movement, dramatic camera angles, highly polished imagery, powerful sound design, energetic editing, emotional intensity, and action sequences designed to overwhelm the audience. Pearl Harbor represented a major challenge because Bay was applying this approach to real history. His previous films had dealt primarily with fictional threats and exaggerated action scenarios. Pearl Harbor, by contrast, was centered on an event in which real people had died and whose consequences had changed the course of world history. This meant that the director had to find a way to combine his instinct for spectacular entertainment with a subject that carried genuine historical and emotional weight. The solution was not to abandon his personal style. Instead, Bay attempted to adapt that style to the material. Pearl Harbor became a historical epic filtered through the visual language of a modern blockbuster. The camera moves rapidly and dramatically. Aircraft sweep across enormous landscapes. Sunlight glows behind characters and military machines. Explosions are presented on a massive scale. Music rises at moments of emotional importance. Individual faces are placed against vast environments, emphasizing the contrast between personal experience and historical events. This contrast between the individual and the enormous is central to Bay's vision for the film. Pearl Harbor repeatedly places its characters inside spaces that appear larger than they are. Rafe and Danny may be the emotional center of the story, but they exist within a world of military bases, battleships, airfields, aircraft carriers, oceans, and eventually global war. The visual scale constantly reminds the audience that the characters' personal problems are unfolding within events that they cannot fully control. Bay's filmmaking philosophy has often emphasized immediacy. His films generally do not ask the audience to observe events from a detached distance. Instead, they attempt to create a feeling of direct involvement. The viewer is placed close to explosions, aircraft, collapsing structures, speeding vehicles, and emotionally intense faces. Pearl Harbor applies this principle to the attack itself. Rather than presenting the event only through distant, strategic views, Bay frequently places the audience among soldiers, sailors, nurses, civilians, and pilots. This approach gives the attack sequence a sense of chaos. The audience does not simply watch bombs fall from above. The camera follows characters as they run through smoke, attempt to escape burning ships, rescue wounded people, and react to sudden destruction. The event is therefore experienced on multiple scales. There are wide images showing the magnitude of the attack, but there are also close shots showing fear and confusion. Bay's visual approach depends heavily on contrast. One of the most obvious contrasts in Pearl Harbor is between beauty and destruction. Hawaii is photographed as a place of extraordinary natural beauty. The ocean, sunlight, green landscapes, beaches, and open skies create an almost idealized vision of paradise. Military life before the attack also contains a sense of youth and freedom. Characters dance, fly, fall in love, joke with one another, and imagine futures that seem open and secure. This visual beauty becomes important because it makes the attack more shocking. The destruction does not occur in a dark battlefield that already appears dangerous. It arrives in a world that has been presented as peaceful and alive. Japanese aircraft suddenly enter a landscape associated with sunlight and calm. Explosions transform familiar spaces. Battleships that had appeared powerful become traps. Airfields become targets. Hospitals become overwhelmed. The idea of destroying paradise is one of the strongest visual concepts in the film. Bay repeatedly emphasizes the contrast between the peaceful image of Hawaii and the violence that suddenly erupts there. This is consistent with his broader style, which often uses visual extremes to create emotional impact. A quiet romantic moment can be followed by a massive explosion. A character's private conversation can suddenly become part of a much larger crisis. The film's romantic storyline is also important to understanding Bay's vision. Although Pearl Harbor is often remembered for its action sequences, Bay did not approach the movie as a pure war film. He and the production team wanted the audience to have an emotional investment in the characters before the historical disaster occurred. The romance between Rafe and Evelyn and the friendship between Rafe and Danny were intended to create that investment. From Bay's perspective, large-scale action becomes more effective when the audience understands what is at risk for individual characters. The attack is not simply a collection of impressive explosions. It interrupts relationships, destroys plans, and changes the emotional lives of the people the audience has been following. This is why the film spends a substantial amount of time establishing the personal relationships before the attack. This choice also reveals Bay's interest in melodrama. His films often embrace emotions openly rather than presenting them with restraint. Characters declare their feelings, experience dramatic losses, and confront situations in which personal loyalty is tested. Pearl Harbor follows this pattern. The love triangle between Rafe, Danny, and Evelyn is intentionally heightened. The emotions are large because the historical environment around them is also large. The result is a style in which personal drama and national drama reflect one another. The friendship between Rafe and Danny is damaged by circumstances neither man expected. Their emotional conflict occurs just as the world around them is transformed by war. In both cases, the characters lose the stability they once assumed would last. Their private lives and the larger historical situation, therefore, become connected through the theme of sudden disruption. Pearl Harbor constructs its world by placing an intimate fictional drama inside one of the most recognizable historical environments of the 20th century. The film does not need to invent an entirely new universe because its setting already exists in history, but it still has to perform a major act of cinematic world-building. The audience must believe in the Hawaii of 1941, understand the military culture surrounding Pearl Harbor, feel the distance between America and the growing war in Europe and Asia, and experience the sudden transformation of a peaceful environment into a battlefield. The setting is therefore much more than a backdrop. Pearl Harbor itself influences the story, determines the emotional atmosphere, and gives meaning to the events experienced by the characters. Hawaii is presented first as a place of beauty, freedom, youth, and opportunity. Later, the same environment becomes a symbol of vulnerability. The peaceful landscapes, bright skies, and open waters that initially suggest security become the spaces through which danger unexpectedly arrives. This transformation is one of the most important elements of the film's world building. The audience is introduced to a version of the world that appears stable. The main characters have ambitions, relationships, careers, and personal problems, but they do not initially live in a world that feels immediately threatened. Even though World War II has already begun elsewhere, the distance between Hawaii and the European battlefields creates a psychological sense of separation. The film uses this sense of distance to establish one of its central ideas. History can feel far away until it suddenly becomes personal. For many of the characters, war is initially something happening somewhere else. It is discussed, anticipated, and connected to international politics, but everyday life continues. Pilots train, nurses work, military personnel follow routines. People go dancing and form relationships. The normal rhythms of life continue despite the growing threat. This makes Pearl Harbor an especially important setting because it represents a border between ordinary life and global conflict. The military base is obviously connected to American defense, but the people living there do not fully experience themselves as participants in an active war until the Japanese attack. The setting, therefore, contains a built-in tension. On the surface, Pearl Harbor is a secure military installation in a beautiful part of the world. Beneath that appearance is the possibility that this apparent security may not last. The film establishes Hawaii as a place that is visually distinct from the environments traditionally associated with war movies. Instead of beginning with mud, ruins, trenches, or devastated cities, Pearl Harbor begins with sunlight, open skies, tropical landscapes, and ocean views. This creates an almost romanticized image of the setting. The environment appears full of life. The visual beauty of Hawaii serves an important narrative purpose. If the setting were already dark and threatening, the attack would have a different emotional effect. By presenting Pearl Harbor as a kind of paradise, the film creates a stronger contrast when destruction arrives. The audience sees something beautiful before seeing it damaged. This contrast between paradise and catastrophe is repeated throughout the film. Bright blue skies later fill with aircraft. Calm water becomes covered in oil, debris, and burning wreckage. Massive ships that appear permanent and powerful become vulnerable to bombs and torpedoes. Hospitals and military facilities designed to protect and organize human life are suddenly overwhelmed by chaos. The world building is therefore based partly on transformation. The physical setting does not disappear, but its meaning changes. A runway that once represented training and opportunity becomes a target. A harbor that symbolizes military strength becomes a place of destruction. The ocean, initially associated with freedom and beauty, becomes both an escape route and a battlefield. The military environment is another major component of the film's constructed world. Pearl Harbor is populated by people whose lives are organized according to rank, duty, routine, and chain of command. The characters exist within institutions that have rules and expectations. Pilots have missions and superiors. Nurses have professional responsibilities. Sailors live and work aboard ships. Officers must make decisions that affect thousands of people. These institutional structures create the rules of the universe in which the characters operate. Personal freedom exists, but it is limited by military duty. Rafe cannot simply choose where he wants to live or what missions he will accept. Danny's relationships and actions are affected by his responsibilities as a military officer. Evelyn works within the demands of military medicine. When the attack begins, individual emotions must compete with larger obligations. This is one of the reasons the setting influences the narrative so strongly. The characters are not living in an ordinary civilian environment where personal decisions affect only themselves. Their lives are connected to a military system, and that system becomes essential when a crisis begins. The rules of military life, which may initially appear restrictive, suddenly become the framework through which people respond to disaster. The film also creates a contrast between civilian identity and military identity. Rafe and Danny are young men with dreams, friendships, romantic desires, and a love of flying. At the same time, they're soldiers. This dual identity becomes increasingly important as the story develops. Before the attack, their military careers are closely connected to personal ambition and excitement. Flying is something they love. After the attack, the meaning of their roles changes. Flying is no longer simply an expression of freedom or skill. It becomes a responsibility connected to survival and war. The setting itself forces this transformation because Pearl Harbor becomes the location where the characters lose the ability to separate their personal lives from history. Pearl Harbor is best understood as a hybrid film that combines several major genres rather than fitting comfortably into only one category. At its core, it is a historical war drama, but that description alone does not fully explain how the movie works. The film also contains the structure of a romantic melodrama, the scale and destructive force of a disaster movie, the energy of an action blockbuster, elements of an adventure film, and the patriotic themes of a traditional World War II epic. This mixture of genres is one of the most important features of Pearl Harbor. It explains both the movie's enormous ambition and the divided reactions it has received. The filmmakers did not attempt to make a narrowly focused military drama. Instead, they tried to create a film that could appeal to audiences interested in history, romance, action, spectacle, and emotional storytelling at the same time. The primary genre of Pearl Harbor is the historical war film. Its central event is the Japanese attack on the American naval base at Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, one of the most significant moments in American history. The film is set during the early stages of the United States' direct involvement in World War II and includes real military figures, historical locations, aircraft, ships, and major events. However, Pearl Harbor differs from a purely realistic or documentary-style war film because much of its narrative is built around fictional characters. Rafe McCawley, Danny Walker, and Evelyn Johnson are not presented as historical figures whose lives can be reconstructed from the historical record. They are fictional characters designed to guide the audience through real events. This is a common technique in historical cinema. Fictional characters allow filmmakers to create a clear emotional structure while placing those characters inside a recognizable historical environment. The advantage is that the audience can experience enormous events through a limited number of personal relationships. The disadvantage is that history may become simplified in order to make room for the fictional narrative. In Pearl Harbor, the fictional characters are not observers standing outside history. They are placed directly inside it. They fly aircraft, serve at the military base, work in hospitals, and participate in the response to the attack. This allows the historical war genre to become highly personal. The war film traditionally explores themes such as courage, sacrifice, duty, survival, leadership, fear, loyalty, and the consequences of violence. Pearl Harbor includes all of these themes, but it approaches them through the language of mainstream blockbuster entertainment. The film is interested in heroic action. Characters are repeatedly placed in situations where they must make rapid decisions under extreme pressure. Pilots attempt to take off while under attack. Sailors try to save others as ships sink. Medical workers struggle to treat enormous numbers of casualties. Later, military personnel prepare for a dangerous mission against Japan. These situations follow familiar conventions of the war genre. Ordinary individuals become heroes because historical circumstances demand extraordinary behavior from them. Personal fear must be overcome. Loyalty is tested. Sacrifice becomes a defining act. At the same time, Pearl Harbor does not focus exclusively on the experience of soldiers in combat. This is where its secondary genres become increasingly important. One of the strongest secondary genres is the romantic melodrama. In fact, the love story occupies a significant portion of the movie and provides the emotional structure that connects the major action sequences. The central romantic conflict is based on a classic love triangle. Rafe and Danny are lifelong friends. Rafe falls in love with Evelyn, but circumstances separate them when he leaves for a dangerous assignment. When Rafe is believed to have died, Evelyn and Danny gradually develop a relationship of their own. The return of Rafe then creates a conflict involving love, friendship, guilt, jealousy, and loyalty. This is pure melodramatic territory. The characters are not dealing with small misunderstandings that can easily be solved. Their emotional problems are intensified by death, war, separation, and the belief that someone they love has been permanently lost. The melodrama genre is based on heightened emotion. Characters experience love intensely, suffer deeply, and face situations in which personal happiness is threatened by forces beyond their control. Pearl Harbor embraces these conventions without much restraint. The love triangle also serves an important structural function. It creates tension before the historical attack occurs. Without the romance, the film would risk becoming a long period of waiting for an event the audience already knows is coming. The relationship between Rafe, Danny, and Evelyn gives the first section of the film its own independent dramatic stakes. This is important because Pearl Harbor is based on a historical event with a predetermined outcome. The audience knows that the attack will happen. The filmmakers, therefore, need another source of uncertainty. The love triangle provides that uncertainty. Viewers may know what will happen to Pearl Harbor, but they do not know how the fictional relationships will be resolved. This allows the film to create suspense on both historical and personal levels. Pearl Harbor also uses conventions associated with the disaster movie. The attack sequence itself follows a structure that is familiar from films about earthquakes, shipwrecks, fires, storms, and other large-scale catastrophes. The disaster genre usually begins by introducing a group of characters before a major event threatens their lives. The audience learns about relationships, personal conflicts, ambitions, and weaknesses. Once the disaster begins, those separate storylines are brought together by a shared crisis. Pearl Harbor follows this pattern closely. Before the attack, the characters occupy different spaces and deal with different problems. Rafe is focused on his relationship with Evelyn and his desire to fly. Danny is connected to both Rafe and Evelyn. Evelyn has her professional life as a nurse and her own emotional struggles. Other military personnel and civilians are also introduced. When the attack begins, these separate lives suddenly become connected by the same disaster. Individual problems do not disappear, but they become secondary to immediate survival. This is one reason the attack sequence is so effective as a genre shift. The opening sequence of Pearl Harbor is carefully designed to establish the emotional world that exists before the historical catastrophe. Although the movie will eventually become a large-scale war epic centered on the attack of December 7th, 1941, it does not begin with military strategy, political arguments, or Japanese aircraft approaching Hawaii. Instead, it begins with childhood, friendship, imagination, and the dream of flight. This choice is essential because the filmmakers want the audience to understand the characters as ordinary people before history transforms their lives. The opening minutes introduce a rural childhood environment and establish Rafe McCawley and Danny Walker as boys who share an unusually strong friendship. They are fascinated by aircraft and aviation, and their interest in flying becomes a defining part of their identities. The early scenes have a deliberately nostalgic quality. The boys are energetic, adventurous, and imaginative. Their enthusiasm for airplanes represents more than a simple childhood hobby. It establishes flying as the central symbol of their relationship and as the skill that will eventually place them directly inside the Second World War. The opening, therefore, begins with innocence rather than violence. This is particularly important because the audience already knows the historical destination of the story. The title itself announces that Pearl Harbor will eventually be attacked. The audience knows that the United States will enter the war and that the characters' peaceful lives cannot continue unchanged. Because of that knowledge, the opening scenes acquire a sense of dramatic irony. The innocence we are watching is temporary. Rafe and Danny do not know this, of course. They experience their childhood world as if it might continue indefinitely. Their dreams are simple. They want to fly. They want adventure. They want to prove themselves. Their friendship feels permanent. The audience, however, knows that history will eventually intervene. This creates one of the most important emotional effects of the opening sequence. The filmmakers are not asking viewers to wonder whether the world will be destroyed. They are asking viewers to become attached to the world before its destruction. The more peaceful and hopeful the beginning feels, the more significant the later transformation becomes. The childhood setting also establishes the idea that Rafe and Danny's relationship is deeper than an ordinary friendship. They are introduced as companions whose shared dream creates a bond that will continue into adulthood. Their friendship is based on a common fascination with flying, and that shared interest eventually becomes the foundation of their military careers. This is an example of efficient character setup. Rather than introducing Rafe and Danny as adults and simply telling the audience that they have been friends for years, the film dramatizes the origin of their bond. The audience sees where the relationship comes from. The boys' fascination with aircraft also establishes the film's larger symbolic language. Throughout Pearl Harbor, airplanes represent freedom, ambition, identity, danger, and ultimately sacrifice. In the opening, however, the aircraft are primarily objects of wonder. They belong to a world of possibility. This meaning will change later. The opening sequence therefore plants an important visual and thematic seed. Flying begins as a dream. It becomes a profession. It becomes a military responsibility. It becomes a means of survival during the attack. And eventually, it becomes a means through which the characters participate in America's response to the attack. The opening minutes establish this trajectory before the audience has seen any major combat. Another important element of the opening is its tone. The atmosphere is warm, nostalgic, playful, and optimistic. There is a sense of freedom and adventure associated with the boys and their interest in aviation. The filmmakers deliberately avoid beginning with the darkness that audiences might expect from a movie about Pearl Harbor. This tonal choice serves two purposes. First, it makes the characters accessible. The audience sees them as young people with dreams rather than as symbols of military history. Second, it creates a contrast with the eventual violence. The movie needs an emotional baseline from which it can move toward tragedy. The opening is therefore not merely a prologue. It establishes the emotional scale of the entire film. The world of childhood is small and personal. The later world of war will be enormous and historical. By starting with two boys, the movie creates a visual and emotional contrast between individual lives and global events. The transition from childhood to adulthood then reinforces the idea that the boys' dreams have survived. When Rafe and Danny are seen as young men, their passion for aviation has become a serious part of their lives. They're no longer simply playing at being pilots. They're training to become professional military aviators. This transition is important because it demonstrates continuity. The boys have grown older, but the essential relationship remains. Their shared dream has become their shared career. The opening adult scenes introduce the characters within the military aviation environment. Rafe is established as talented, confident, and ambitious. Danny is presented as his close companion and fellow pilot. Their relationship contains friendly competition, humor, and loyalty. The audience is therefore given a basic understanding of their personalities before the romantic storyline becomes central. Rafe is the more impulsive and emotionally driven of the two. He has a strong confidence in his abilities and tends to act according to instinct. Danny is more grounded and disciplined, although he shares Rafe's enthusiasm for flying. Their personalities complement each other, which helps explain why their friendship is so durable. The film does not need a lengthy psychological explanation of their relationship, because the opening has already established its history. The pilot's relationship with flying also contributes to the tone of these early scenes. Flying is presented as exhilarating. The aircraft are beautiful, powerful machines, and the characters clearly enjoy being in the air. The central conflicts of Pearl Harbor operate on several different levels at the same time. On the surface, the movie is about the United States entering the Second World War after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Beneath that historical conflict, however, the film is driven by a series of personal struggles involving friendship, romantic love, jealousy, duty, survival, grief, and sacrifice. The story becomes effective when these different levels of conflict intersect. The characters are not simply fighting an external enemy. They're also fighting circumstances within themselves and within their relationships. The film's most important structural decision is to make the personal conflicts begin before the historical conflict reaches its climax. This means that when Pearl Harbor is attacked, the characters are already emotionally vulnerable. They are not starting the war as blank figures who suddenly become heroes. They already have relationships, ambitions, fears, disagreements, and unresolved problems. The primary external conflict is the war itself. At the beginning of the film, the United States is not yet directly involved in the European War, although the international situation is becoming increasingly dangerous. Rafe and Danny are military pilots, but their daily lives are still relatively removed from the full scale of global conflict. Their military careers are connected to preparation rather than the total mobilization that will follow the attack. The Japanese attack destroys this separation. Suddenly, the characters are no longer living beside the possibility of war. They are inside it. This transition is the central external conflict of the movie. The United States is attacked, Pearl Harbor is devastated, and the characters are forced to respond. However, the film's external conflict is deliberately personalized. The audience does not experience the war primarily through generals, diplomats, or strategic maps. Instead, the conflict is experienced through individuals who are caught inside events much larger than themselves. Rafe experiences the war as a pilot, a lover, and a friend. Danny experiences it as a pilot and as the person whose relationship with Rafe is threatened by circumstances. Evelyn experiences it as a nurse, a lover, and a woman whose personal future becomes increasingly uncertain. The attack affects each character differently, which allows the film to transform a large historical event into a series of individual stakes. The internal conflicts are equally important. Rafe's greatest internal struggle involves his competing desires for love, independence, courage, and responsibility. He is a naturally adventurous character who wants to fly and prove himself. His confidence is one of his greatest strengths, but can also become recklessness. He wants to participate directly in the war because he sees military flying as a meaningful expression of his identity. At the same time, he falls deeply in love with Evelyn. These two desires are not necessarily incompatible at first, but the war makes them increasingly difficult to reconcile. Rafe's decision to leave for Europe demonstrates this conflict. He wants to serve, but his departure also separates him from Evelyn. His desire to fight, therefore, has a personal cost. The film does not present that cost as purely negative. Rafe believes that participating in the war is the right thing to do. Yet the narrative also shows that heroic choices can cause emotional damage. This becomes even more complicated when Rafe is believed to have been killed. His supposed death creates a chain of conflicts that affects everyone. For Evelyn, the conflict becomes one of grief and survival. For Danny, it becomes a conflict between loyalty to his friend and his growing love for Evelyn. For Rafe, when he returns, the conflict becomes one of jealousy, betrayal, and understanding. The love triangle is therefore not simply a romantic subplot. It is a major mechanism through which the movie explores the consequences of war. The film's most important personal conflict may therefore be the relationship between Rafe and Danny. Their friendship has been established as one of the strongest emotional bonds in the story. They have known each other since childhood and share a passion for flying. Because of this history, the romantic conflict between them becomes painful. Danny does not simply become interested in a woman who happens to be Rafe's former partner. He becomes involved with Evelyn during a period when he believes Rafe is dead. This distinction matters because it prevents the conflict from becoming completely simple. Danny is not deliberately trying to betray his friend. Evelyn is not deliberately trying to replace Rafe. Rafe is not completely wrong to feel hurt when he discovers what has happened. The situation is emotionally complicated because everyone involved has experienced loss and uncertainty. This creates a conflict in which there is no easy villain. The character's emotions become the obstacle. Jealousy, grief, guilt, and love all compete with loyalty. The war intensifies these emotions because it makes time feel limited. The characters do not know how long they will live. They make decisions under the pressure of separation and death. This is one reason the movie's romantic conflict remains connected to the larger historical conflict. The characters are not living in a normal society where relationships can develop slowly and predictably. They are living in wartime. The possibility of death changes how people understand love. Evelyn believes Rafe is dead. Danny believes he has lost his best friend. When the two become close, they are trying to continue living. Rafe's return then forces them to confront a reality they thought they had already accepted. The conflict therefore emerges from grief as much as jealousy. This makes the emotional situation more complicated than a conventional love triangle. The film also creates conflict between individual desire and military duty. Rafe wants Evelyn, but he also wants to fly. Danny wants to protect his friendship, but he also develops his own relationship with Evelyn. Evelyn wants love and stability, but her profession requires her to care for others during wartime. These characters cannot simply choose whatever makes them happiest because the historical situation constantly interferes. Military duty becomes one of the forces that controls their lives. The attack on Pearl Harbor dramatically increases this pressure. Before the attack, the characters have time to think about romance and personal ambitions. When discussing the villains and antagonistic forces in Pearl Harbor, it is important to recognize that the film does not operate like a conventional villain-centered action movie. There is no single Japanese character who functions as the personal mastermind behind everything that happens to the protagonists. Instead, the film divides its antagonistic forces between historical events, military institutions, enemy commanders, individual enemy pilots, and the personal conflicts that develop among the main characters themselves. This distinction is important because Pearl Harbor is ultimately structured around a historical catastrophe rather than a traditional hero versus villain story. The attack on Pearl Harbor is the central antagonistic event, but the people responsible for planning and executing the attack exist mostly at a distance from the fictional protagonists. The Japanese military is therefore presented primarily as an organized opposing force, rather than as a collection of deeply developed individual villains. The film's most important antagonistic force is the Japanese attack itself. The attack is something the protagonist cannot negotiate with, reason with, or emotionally defeat. It arrives suddenly and transforms their environment. It destroys ships, aircraft, buildings, relationships, assumptions, and lives. Unlike a conventional villain, it does not have a face that the audience can confront directly. It is represented through aircraft, explosions, weapons, smoke, fire, and destruction. This makes the attack almost function like a natural disaster from the character's perspective. There is, however, a crucial difference. A natural disaster has no intention. The attack does. The Japanese military deliberately plans and executes the assault, meaning that the destruction is the result of human decisions rather than an unavoidable force of nature. This gives the film's antagonist a moral dimension. The attack is not merely something that happens. It is something that someone chooses to do. The film, therefore, transforms a historical military decision into the central source of danger facing its fictional characters. The Japanese Admiral Isoroki Yamamoto occupies an important position within this structure. He is not presented as a personal villain who spends the film pursuing Rafe or Danny. Instead, he represents the strategic intelligence behind the attack and the larger Japanese military leadership responsible for the operation. Yamamoto is portrayed as a serious military strategist who understands the enormous risks involved in attacking the United States. His presence gives the Japanese side a degree of strategic rationality rather than portraying the attack as completely irrational aggression. This is significant because the movie needs the audience to understand that the attack is the result of planning and calculation. The Japanese forces are not simply acting randomly. They are attempting to achieve a specific strategic objective. The attack is intended to damage the American Pacific Fleet and temporarily weaken the United States' ability to respond. Within the film's dramatic structure, this makes Yamamoto an important representative of the larger military system. He represents strategy. The pilots represent execution. Pearl Harbor represents the target. The American characters represent the human consequences. However, Yamamoto is not developed with the same psychological depth as Rafe, Danny, or Evelyn. His function is primarily historical and strategic. He gives the enemy side a recognizable authority figure without becoming the personal nemesis of the protagonists. This reflects one of the film's limitations as a character-driven historical drama. The American protagonists receive extensive emotional development, while many of the Japanese characters remain connected to the military operation rather than being developed as individuals. The Japanese pilots themselves function as another antagonistic force. During the attack, they're shown as highly organized, skilled, and dangerous. Their aircraft move in coordinated formations, and their attacks demonstrate preparation and tactical discipline. This presentation is important because it increases the credibility of the threat. If the enemy were shown as incompetent, the American characters would not appear particularly heroic for surviving or resisting them. The effectiveness of the antagonistic force, therefore, depends partly on competence. The Japanese attack is dangerous because it is organized. The aircraft arrive with speed and coordination. The defenders are caught by surprise. The initial American response is chaotic. This imbalance creates the tension necessary for the attack sequence. The Japanese pilots are therefore effective antagonists because they create an immediate physical threat that overwhelms the characters' normal expectations. The film also uses the visual presentation of the attack to create a sense of faceless menace. The audience frequently sees aircraft approaching from above or from distant positions. The pilots themselves are often less important than the machines they control. This has the effect of turning the Japanese Air Force into a moving force of destruction. The planes become extensions of the antagonist. This is one reason the aircraft are so important to the film's visual language. The same machines that represent freedom when Rafe and Danny fly them become symbols of danger when the Japanese attack. The film deliberately creates a visual contrast between American and Japanese aircraft. The audience learns to recognize the difference between them, allowing the appearance of enemy aircraft to create immediate tension. Before the attack, an airplane can represent adventure. During the attack, the same general category of object becomes terrifying. This transformation is one of the film's most effective uses of visual storytelling. The antagonist is therefore not only the enemy pilot. It is the aircraft. It is the formation. It is the sound. It is the speed. It is the unexpected arrival. It is the destruction that follows. The attack operates almost like a giant machine. Individual enemy pilots become parts of that machine. This also explains why the film does not need a traditional villain to create tension during the central action sequence. The audience already understands the objective of the attacking force. Destroy the American fleet. Destroy aircraft. Pearl Harbor can be analyzed through several different storytelling frameworks, but the most useful approach is to recognize that the movie does not have only one protagonist in the traditional sense. Rafe McCawley is the character who most closely follows a conventional hero's journey, while Danny Walker functions as both his closest companion and a parallel protagonist. Evelyn Johnson also undergoes a substantial emotional journey of her own. The movie therefore combines the hero's journey with a three-act structure in which the three central characters are repeatedly brought together, separated, tested, and transformed by war. If we use the classic hero's journey model as a guide, Rafe's story begins in what could be described as an ordinary world. This ordinary world is not literally peaceful in every sense, because the characters are living during an era of growing international tension. However, from Rafe's personal perspective, his world is relatively simple. He has a lifelong friendship with Danny, a passion for flying, and a strong desire to become a military pilot. The childhood relationship between Rafe and Danny is especially important because it establishes the emotional foundation of Rafe's journey. The two boys grow up together and develop a fascination with aviation. Their shared dream is to fly. This early dream functions almost like the seed of the entire story. Flying initially represents freedom. It represents escape from limitations. It represents adventure. It also represents the bond between the two friends. As children, Rafe and Danny are not thinking about the geopolitical consequences of military aviation. They're interested in the feeling of being in the air. This creates an important contrast with the later parts of the film. By the time they become military pilots, flying has become connected to combat, death, responsibility, and national duty. The same dream that once represented freedom eventually becomes a source of danger. This transformation is one of the clearest examples of character development in the movie. The ordinary world stage, therefore, establishes more than setting. It establishes what Rafe is trying to protect. He wants his friendship. He wants his freedom. He wants his future. And eventually, he wants Evelyn. The next stage of the hero's journey is the call to adventure. For Rafe, this call comes through his military career and the growing reality of the Second World War. He is not content to remain on the sidelines. When the opportunity arises to participate in the conflict in Europe, he wants to go. His motivation is partly patriotic and partly personal. He wants to prove himself. He wants to fly. He wants to experience the kind of action that he believes his training has prepared him for. But the call to adventure also creates a conflict with his romantic relationship. Rafe has fallen in love with Evelyn, and leaving for war means separating himself from her. This is the first major indication that his hero's journey will require sacrifice. The classic hero's journey often asks the protagonist to leave the familiar world behind. Rafe literally does this. He leaves behind his friend. He leaves behind Evelyn. He leaves behind the relative safety of the United States. He enters a world where the rules are different. In this new world, death is immediate and unpredictable. The journey, therefore, has both a geographical and psychological dimension. Rafe travels to Europe, but he also moves away from the innocence of his previous life. His departure represents the first major threshold crossing. He is no longer simply a young pilot with a dream. He is now a participant in war. The next hero's journey stage is often described as meeting mentors. Pearl Harbor does not use this stage in a completely traditional way. There is no single mysterious mentor who teaches Rafe the secret of life. Instead, guidance comes from several sources. Military instructors and commanders provide professional guidance. Danny provides emotional companionship. Evelyn provides emotional motivation. The older generation of military figures represents the institutional knowledge required to survive the war. In other words, the film distributes the mentor function among several characters. This is common in large-scale ensemble stories. The hero does not receive all of his knowledge from one person. He learns through relationships, training, experience, and failure. Danny is particularly important because he functions as a companion and mirror. He is Rafe's best friend, but he is also a reflection of Rafe. Both men are pilots. Both are courageous. Both are competitive. Both care about Evelyn. Both are shaped by the war. Yet they respond to circumstances differently. Rafe is more impulsive. Danny is often more cautious and emotionally controlled. This contrast allows the two characters to develop in parallel. Their friendship is therefore one of the central structural devices in the movie. The hero's journey also includes a crossing into a special world. For Rafe, Europe represents this special world at first. The environment is unfamiliar. The dangers are greater. The consequences are more serious. He encounters aerial combat and realizes that his childhood dream of flying has become connected to killing and survival. This is an important transformation. The hero's journey often requires the protagonist to discover that the world he imagined is not the world he actually enters. Rafe wants to fly. He discovers that flying in wartime means confronting death. He wants to prove himself. He discovers that courage involves more than individual skill. He wants to serve. He discovers that service requires sacrifice. The special world, therefore, challenges his assumptions. Rafe's time in Europe also gives him the opportunity to demonstrate his abilities. He becomes a capable pilot. His talent is recognized. He appears to be moving toward the heroic identity he imagined for himself. But the journey does not simply reward him. It also creates consequences. His relationship with Evelyn is threatened by distance. His military service puts his life at risk. Eventually, his disappearance creates one of the most important turning points in the entire story. Rafe is believed to have died. This moment functions like a symbolic death. In the hero's journey, the protagonist often experiences a descent into an extreme state of danger, loss, or transformation. Rafe's disappearance serves a similar function. Pearl Harbor was designed as a large-scale cinematic spectacle, and its technology and special effects were among the most important elements in creating that spectacle. The film was released in 2001, at a point when computer-generated imagery had already become an important part of major Hollywood productions, but filmmakers were still relying heavily on practical effects. Miniature work, full-scale sets, physical aircraft, pyrotechnics, mechanical effects, compositing, and carefully coordinated stunt photography. Pearl Harbor represents this transitional period particularly well. It does not depend entirely on computer graphics, nor does it attempt to reproduce the attack entirely through practical filmmaking. Instead, it combines real physical elements with digital manipulation to create a version of Pearl Harbor that could not have been photographed directly in a modern world. The technological challenge facing the filmmakers was enormous. The historical attack took place in December 1941. The real harbor had changed dramatically by the beginning of the 21st century. Many of the original ships no longer existed. The military aircraft of the period were rare and expensive. The original harbor could not simply be transformed back into its wartime appearance. Thousands of people could not safely be placed around full-scale explosions. Ships could not realistically be destroyed repeatedly for the sake of filming. Aircraft could not perform every maneuver required by the screenplay, and many of the most dramatic events had to be recreated rather than directly photographed. The special effects team, therefore, had to construct a believable visual version of a historical event using a mixture of physical and digital techniques. One of the most important aspects of the production was its use of real aircraft and historically recognizable aviation machinery. This was crucial because airplanes are central to the identity of the film. Rafe and Danny are pilots. Flying is part of their character development. The Japanese attack is primarily an aerial assault. The later military missions also depend heavily on aircraft. If the planes looked obviously artificial, the entire movie would lose credibility. The filmmakers therefore made significant efforts to create convincing aircraft photography. The physical presence of real aircraft gives the aerial scenes a sense of weight. When an actual aircraft moves through the frame, the camera captures real reflections, real shadows, real vibrations, and real interactions with the surrounding air. These details are extremely difficult to reproduce perfectly through computer graphics. The audience may not consciously identify each of these details, but they contribute to the feeling that the aircraft are physically present. This becomes especially important during close shots. The camera can move around an aircraft. The aircraft can interact with smoke and light. The actors can appear alongside physical machines. The audience receives visual evidence that the object exists in the same physical world as the characters. This gives the action greater realism. At the same time, the filmmakers could not use real aircraft for every shot. Some maneuvers would have been impossible or dangerous. Some historical aircraft were unavailable in sufficient numbers. Some shots required aircraft to fly in formations or locations that could not safely be achieved with real planes. This is where visual effects become essential. Computer-generated aircraft could be inserted into large formations. Digital compositing could combine separately filmed elements. Backgrounds could be extended. Additional ships could be created. Smoke could be enhanced. Explosions could be multiplied. The digital tools effectively expanded the physical production. Rather than replacing practical filmmaking entirely, computer graphics allowed the filmmakers to make a relatively small number of physical resources appear much larger. This is one of the most important principles behind large-scale visual effects. The audience does not necessarily need to see thousands of real objects. The filmmakers need to create the impression that thousands of objects exist. Digital compositing is particularly useful for this purpose. An aircraft can be filmed separately. A background can be filmed separately. A ship can be filmed separately. Smoke can be created separately. All of these elements can then be combined into a single image. The result can appear to have been photographed simultaneously, even though it was constructed from multiple sources. This technique is particularly important in the Pearl Harbor attack sequence. The attack needs to feel enormous. The audience needs to see dozens of aircraft. Ships need to appear to be under simultaneous attack. Explosions need to occur across a wide area. Smoke needs to fill the environment. The harbor needs to appear overwhelmed. This level of destruction could not be created safely or practically with full-scale physical effects alone. Digital technology, therefore, becomes essential to creating scale. The filmmakers also relied heavily on practical explosions and pyrotechnics. This is important because explosions are not simply visual objects. They create physical reactions. Fire produces light. Smoke changes the atmosphere. Debris moves through the environment. Actors react to pressure and heat. Cameras can shake. Objects can physically break. These effects give the scenes an immediacy that purely digital explosions can sometimes lack. The combination of practical and digital effects is therefore particularly effective. A physical explosion can provide the foreground event. Digital effects can extend the destruction into the background. A real piece of debris can fly past the camera. Computer-generated debris can then increase the amount of destruction. The audience experiences the combined result as a single event. This blending of technologies is one of the defining characteristics of the movie's visual style. The filmmakers also had to recreate the ships at Pearl Harbor. This was another enormous challenge. The historical fleet included large battleships and numerous support vessels. Destroying real ships for filming was obviously impossible. Instead, the filmmakers could use physical set pieces, partial structures, miniatures, digital models, and compositing. Large sections of ships could be constructed at a manageable scale. These sections could then be photographed during explosions. Pearl Harbor is a film built around emotional contrasts. It combines romance, friendship, patriotism, tragedy, combat, sacrifice, grief, jealousy, and hope, and much of its emotional power comes from placing these experiences next to one another. The movie does not remain at one emotional intensity for its entire running time. Instead, it repeatedly moves from warmth to danger, from romance to separation, from excitement to fear, and from victory to loss. This constant movement is important because the film is trying to make a very large historical event understandable through the experiences of a small group of fictional characters. At the center of the emotional structure are Rafe McCawley, Danny Walker, and Evelyn Johnson. Their relationships provide the personal framework through which the audience experiences the larger historical story. The attack on Pearl Harbor is an enormous event involving thousands of people, ships, aircraft, soldiers, nurses, and civilians. It would be impossible for a single audience member to emotionally identify with all of them individually. Instead, the movie concentrates attention on a few characters and uses their experiences to give the historical event a human face. The first major source of emotion is the friendship between Rafe and Danny. Their relationship begins in childhood. They are connected by shared memories, shared dreams, and shared experiences. Their fascination with aviation creates a bond that survives into adulthood. This is important because the audience is encouraged to see them as more than military partners. They are brothers in everything but blood. Their friendship gives the audience an emotional investment before the major historical events begin. When the two men eventually become military pilots, their shared dream appears to have become reality. They have achieved what they wanted. They can fly. They can surf. They can experience adventure. But the film gradually reveals that their dream has consequences. The same airplanes that once represented freedom eventually become instruments of war. This creates emotional irony. Something beautiful becomes dangerous. Something associated with childhood becomes associated with death. The audience therefore experiences the character's aviation dream in two different ways. Early on, flying feels exhilarating. Later, it becomes frightening. That transformation is essential to the emotional development of the film. Another important emotional foundation is the relationship between Rafe and Evelyn. Their romance is designed to give the audience a sense of what the characters are fighting to preserve. Before the war becomes overwhelming, Rafe and Evelyn experience moments of intimacy, humor, excitement, and affection. These scenes create a temporary emotional refuge. The audience sees the possibility of a normal life. Rafe could return from military service. Evelyn could continue her career. Danny could remain his best friend. The three could remain connected. The war threatens all of these possibilities. The emotional impact of the movie depends partly on the audience believing that the characters have something valuable to lose. If the romance did not matter, separation would not matter. If the friendship did not matter, betrayal would not matter. If the characters did not feel real enough to the audience, their survival would not matter. The early romantic material, therefore, performs an important structural function. It creates emotional stakes before the action begins. One of the most important emotional devices is separation. War separates people physically and emotionally. Rafe leaves for Europe. Evelyn remains behind. Danny stays connected to Evelyn. Rafe becomes isolated. These separations create longing. The audience is encouraged to imagine that the characters want to return to the lives they had before. This makes the idea of home emotionally important. Home is not simply a geographic location. Home is Evelyn. Home is Danny. Home is the possibility of peace. Home is the world that existed before the attack. When Rafe eventually returns, the audience expects a reunion. Instead, he discovers that life has changed. This creates a particularly painful emotional reversal. Rafe's apparent death had allowed Danny and Evelyn to develop a relationship. From Rafe's perspective, he has returned from the dead only to discover that the emotional world he expected to recover no longer exists. The situation creates a complex mixture of emotions. Rafe feels betrayed. Danny feels guilty. Evelyn feels conflicted. The audience is placed in the uncomfortable position of understanding all three perspectives. This is important because the movie does not present the romantic triangle as a simple conflict between a hero and a villain. Danny is not evil. Evelyn is not intentionally cruel. Rafe is not completely innocent in his emotional reactions. Everyone is responding to an extraordinary situation. That complexity makes the conflict more emotionally engaging. The audience can sympathize with Rafe's pain while also understanding why Evelyn moved on. The audience can understand Danny's guilt while recognizing that his relationship with Evelyn has hurt his best friend. This emotional ambiguity gives the story more depth than a simple love triangle. The next major emotional turning point is the Pearl Harbor attack. The emotional impact of this sequence comes from the contrast between the peaceful world established earlier and the sudden destruction that follows. The audience has spent time seeing the characters live, work, laugh, fall in love, and pursue their dreams. Then the world changes almost instantly. The attack is therefore not merely an action scene. It is an emotional rupture. The audience experiences shock because the characters experience shock. There is initially confusion. People do not immediately understand what is happening. Then recognition. Then panic. Then attempts to respond. Then overwhelming destruction. This progression mirrors the psychological experience of a disaster. The attack becomes particularly powerful because the movie has already established the harbor as a place associated with everyday life. The characters are not entering a battlefield expecting combat. They are beginning another day. The sudden appearance of enemy aircraft violates that expectation. This is one reason surprise is such a powerful emotional tool in the sequence. Pearl Harbor is an unusual case when it comes to adaptation because it is not a straightforward adaptation of a single novel, memoir, biography, or historical nonfiction book. The film is primarily an original screenplay set against a real historical event. Its story uses the attack on Pearl Harbor, the American entry into World War II, and the Doolittle Raid as its historical framework, but the central romantic triangle involving Rafe McCawley, Danny Walker, and Evelyn Johnson is fictional. This distinction is extremely important when analyzing the movie as an adaptation. Pearl Harbor is not adapting one existing fictional story and transferring it from a book to the screen. Instead, it is adapting history into a dramatic narrative. The filmmakers take real events, real people, real military operations, and a real historical environment and combine them with invented characters and relationships. The result is therefore best understood as a historical dramatization rather than a conventional literary adaptation. The film's basic historical framework is real. The attack on Pearl Harbor occurred on December 7, 1941. Japanese forces launched a surprise attack against the American naval base in Hawaii, causing enormous loss of life and destroying or damaging numerous American ships and aircraft. The attack resulted in the United States entering the Second World War. The movie also incorporates the American response represented by the Doolittle Raid against Japan in April 1942. However, the central characters are fictional. Rafe McCawley is fictional. Danny Walker is fictional. Evelyn Johnson is fictional. Their romantic relationships are fictional. Their personal experiences are fictionalized. Their individual interactions with major historical figures are dramatically constructed. This gives the filmmakers considerable freedom. Instead of being restricted to the documented life of one historical person, the screenplay can create characters whose experiences allow the audience to move through several major phases of the war. This approach has both strengths and weaknesses. The greatest strength is accessibility. History can be complicated. Military operations involve hundreds of decisions, thousands of participants, and enormous geopolitical consequences. A screenplay cannot realistically reproduce every relevant event. By creating fictional protagonists, the filmmakers can simplify the narrative around a small group of people. The audience does not need to follow dozens of historical figures. Instead, it follows three central characters whose lives intersect with the larger events. This makes the historical story emotionally accessible. The audience learns about the attack by watching what happens to people they already know. The historical event becomes the background against which their personal drama unfolds. This is a familiar strategy in historical cinema. A fictional character can serve as a guide through a real event. The character does not have to be historically famous. Their purpose is to give the audience a human point of entry. Pearl Harbor uses Rafe, Danny, and Evelyn in exactly this way. The audience begins with their childhood and follows their development into adulthood. Their lives then intersect with military history. The attack on Pearl Harbor becomes the moment when their private lives collide with national history. This structure makes the history easier to dramatize. It also allows the movie to move between romance and warfare. A conventional historical account might begin with political tensions between Japan and the United States. It might explain economic sanctions, diplomatic negotiations, military planning, intelligence failures, and strategic considerations. Pearl Harbor instead begins with characters. The audience becomes emotionally attached to them before the historical crisis fully arrives. This is a deliberate adaptation strategy. History is being adapted not only into visual form, but into emotional form. The filmmakers are essentially asking a question. What would this historical event feel like if we experienced it through the lives of three young Americans? The answer is the movie. This means that the film is not attempting to provide a complete historical account. It is attempting to provide a dramatic experience inspired by history. That distinction explains many of the creative decisions in the screenplay. The first major change from historical reality is the invention of the central love triangle. There was no real historical triangle corresponding directly to Rafe, Danny, and Evelyn. The relationship exists because a dramatic movie needs an emotional engine. The romance gives the audience a personal reason to care about the characters. Without it, the movie would have to rely much more heavily on military and political storytelling. The filmmakers instead create an emotional conflict that continues before, during, and after the attack. The love triangle also gives the movie a way to connect the characters across different locations. Rafe can be separated from Evelyn. Danny can remain with Evelyn. Rafe can return. Their relationships can change. The attack can affect their personal lives. The military missions can then bring them back together. The historical events become mechanisms through which the romantic story develops. This is dramatically convenient. It is also one of the reasons the movie has been criticized by some viewers for giving the fictional romance such a large role in a historical story. From one perspective, the romance humanizes history. From another, it occupies screen time that could have been used to explore the historical event itself. This tension is central to the adaptation question. How much history should a historical movie contain? And how much fictional drama is acceptable when the real historical event is already so important? Pearl Harbor chooses drama. The film's creators appear to have recognized that a literal reconstruction of the historical event would not provide the emotional structure of a conventional Hollywood movie. The attack itself occurs relatively late in the narrative. The audience spends substantial time with the fictional characters before the historical catastrophe. This is not how a documentary or military history would be structured. It is how a character-driven drama is structured. The audience needs to know what the characters want before the story can take those things away. That is why the romance and friendship are established first. They provide emotional stakes for the historical event. Pearl Harbor is a movie that operates on several levels at the same time. On the surface, it is a large-scale romantic war epic filled with aircraft, explosions, military uniforms, ships, romance, and dramatic confrontations. Underneath that surface, however, the film contains a considerable number of smaller details that help establish its period setting, foreshadow later events, connect fictional characters to historical circumstances, and reinforce some of the movie's major themes. Because the film is set during one of the most recognizable events in 20th century history, many of its hidden details are not traditional Easter eggs in the same way that viewers might find references hidden inside a superhero movie. Instead, they often involve historical references, visual foreshadowing, symbolic objects, recurring images, background details, and connections between the beginning and ending of the story. One of the most important hidden structural details is the way the movie establishes aviation as part of Rafe and Danny's identities before they become military pilots. The opening childhood material is not simply there to show that the two boys have known each other for a long time. It establishes the foundation for their adult relationship. They grow up fascinated by machines and flying. Their imagination is connected to the idea of becoming pilots. This means that when the movie later places them inside military aircraft, the audience understands that flying is not merely their profession. It is part of their shared dream. This becomes especially meaningful after the Pearl Harbor attack. The airplanes that once represented childhood freedom become instruments of war. The same basic dream has changed meaning. That is a form of visual and thematic foreshadowing. The movie is telling the audience very early that aircraft will be central to these characters' lives. It also suggests that their friendship will be tested through the world of aviation. Another important hidden detail is the relationship between Rafe and Danny's childhood and their adult military careers. The two boys initially treat flying almost like an adventure. They are fascinated by the idea of becoming pilots. Their enthusiasm has the innocence of childhood. Later, when they are professional pilots, the consequences of that dream become much more serious. The audience can therefore look backward and reinterpret the early scenes. What once seemed innocent now feels almost tragic. The boys wanted to fly. They eventually achieved that dream. But they entered a world in which flying could mean killing or being killed. This is one of the movie's most important forms of retrospective meaning. The early scenes become more emotionally significant after the audience knows what happens later. The film also uses the idea of the airplane as a recurring symbol. Aircraft represent freedom, masculinity, ambition, danger, technology, war, and eventually sacrifice. For Rafe, flying is almost an extension of his personality. He is confident and aggressive in the air. His physical skill allows him to express qualities that are more difficult for him to communicate emotionally. This creates a connection between his personality and his aircraft. When he is flying, he appears completely comfortable. When he is dealing with love, loss, or uncertainty, he becomes much more vulnerable. The airplane, therefore, becomes a kind of emotional refuge. This is an important detail because it explains why the aerial scenes carry more significance than simple action sequences. They are moments in which the characters return to a world they understand. Another recurring idea is the contrast between the sky and the ground. The sky represents freedom and possibility during the early parts of the story. The ground represents home, relationships, and ordinary life. Once war begins, these meanings become complicated. The sky becomes dangerous because enemy aircraft arrive from above. The ground becomes dangerous because bombs and gunfire reach the people below. The characters are effectively trapped between two worlds. This visual contrast becomes particularly powerful during the attack. The beautiful Hawaiian sky, which had previously been associated with freedom, becomes the source of destruction. That reversal is not accidental. It reinforces the movie's larger theme that war can transform familiar things into symbols of fear. The movie also contains visual reminders of the technological transition taking place during the period. The aircraft, vehicles, weapons, radios, uniforms, and military equipment are designed to establish a world that is materially different from the modern one. This is easy to overlook because the production design is so extensive. However, the details matter. The movie wants the audience to believe that these characters are living in 1941 rather than in a modern recreation of 1941. The technology is therefore part of the storytelling. The limited communication technology of the period is particularly important. The characters cannot communicate with each other with the speed and convenience modern audiences take for granted. This contributes to the sense of isolation. Information moves slowly. People cannot instantly confirm what is happening. During the attack, confusion is therefore believable. The absence of modern communication systems is not simply historical decoration. It affects how the characters experience the crisis. Another important detail is the use of uniforms and insignia. Military clothing allows the audience to distinguish between characters, branches of service, and national forces. It also helps establish character identity. Uniforms make the characters part of an institution larger than themselves. At the beginning, Rafe and Danny are individuals with personal dreams. Once they enter military service, they become representatives of a larger organization. The uniform symbolizes that transformation. Their individual identities remain important, but they are now connected to national duty. This creates an underlying conflict between personal desire and collective responsibility. The movie repeatedly returns to this conflict. Rafe wants Evelyn. Danny wants Evelyn. But both men also have responsibilities as pilots. Evelyn wants personal happiness. Pearl Harbor was conceived and marketed as one of the biggest Hollywood productions of its period. It was not designed as a modest historical drama or a specialized war movie aimed at a narrow audience. From the beginning, the project represented a major financial commitment involving a large production budget, extensive visual effects, substantial sets and locations, major stars, large-scale action sequences, and an aggressive worldwide marketing campaign. The business story of Pearl Harbor is therefore almost as important as its artistic story. The movie was released in May 2001, at a time when Hollywood studios were increasingly relying on large event movies to generate enormous theatrical revenues, international recognition, merchandise opportunities, and home video sales. The film arrived with expectations that went far beyond simply recovering its production cost. The studio behind the movie was Walt Disney Pictures, working through its Touchstone Pictures label. The involvement of Disney was significant because the company had the financial resources, distribution network, and marketing infrastructure required for a production of this scale. The movie was directed by Michael Bay, who had already established himself as a filmmaker associated with large-scale commercial entertainment. His previous successes had demonstrated that he could turn action spectacle into a major theatrical attraction. The combination of Michael Bay, a famous historical event, major stars, romance, and massive action sequences created the ingredients for what Hollywood would traditionally call an event picture. The budget was enormous for its time. Estimates commonly place the production budget in the range of roughly $140 to $150 million, depending on how different industry sources account for production expenses. That made Pearl Harbor one of the most expensive films produced up to that point. This figure is important because a movie with such a budget has a very different financial threshold from an inexpensive independent production. If a film costs $20 million to make, a moderate theatrical performance may still be commercially successful. If a film costs around $150 million before marketing and distribution expenses, the studio needs much greater revenue. And the production budget is only part of the financial equation. Major Hollywood releases also require advertising. The marketing campaign for Pearl Harbor was extensive because the movie was being positioned as a major summer event. Television advertising, trailers, posters, newspaper advertising, promotional appearances, international publicity, and other forms of marketing all added to the overall cost of bringing the film to audiences. This means that simply comparing the box office total to the production budget does not tell us the studio's actual profit. Theatrical revenue is also divided between theaters and distributors. A movie does not simply receive every dollar spent by someone buying a ticket. Cinemas keep a portion of ticket sales, while the studio receives the remainder. The exact split varies by market, theater, contract, and week of release. Therefore, a film can earn several $100 million at the global box office and still have a much smaller amount available to recover its production and marketing costs. This is particularly relevant when evaluating Pearl Harbor. The movie was not a financial failure in the ordinary sense. It generated hundreds of millions of dollars worldwide. However, because it was so expensive, the question was whether the scale of its box office performance justified the enormous investment. Pearl Harbor opened strongly in the United States. Its opening weekend was significant because the film had been heavily promoted as one of the major releases of the summer. The movie benefited from the recognizable historical subject, Michael Bay's reputation, the star power of Ben Affleck, Josh Hartnett, and Kate Beckinsale, and the promise of spectacular aerial and naval action. Audiences were clearly interested. The movie earned well over $50 million during its opening weekend in North America, making it one of the year's major launches. However, the film's commercial story was not simply about opening weekend. Large event movies are expected to sustain strong attendance after opening. Word of mouth becomes particularly important for expensive productions because the movie needs to continue attracting audiences over several weeks. Pearl Harbor's reception was mixed. Many viewers praised the scale of the attack sequence and the production values. Others criticized the romantic storyline, the length, the historical simplifications, and the melodramatic tone. This division affected the movie's long-term theatrical performance. The film remained commercially substantial, but it did not develop the kind of overwhelming critical consensus that can turn a blockbuster into a cultural phenomenon. Internationally, however, the movie continued to perform strongly. Its worldwide theatrical gross reached roughly $450 million. That number made it one of the major commercial releases of 2001. In other words, Pearl Harbor was able to attract a very large global audience despite its mixed critical reception. This distinction is important. Commercial success and critical approval are not the same thing. Pearl Harbor is a particularly useful example because its financial performance was considerably stronger than the response from many professional critics. The film received numerous negative or mixed reviews. Critics frequently argued that the movie's romantic storyline dominated a historical event that deserved greater attention. Some criticized the dialogue and melodrama. Others argued that the movie simplified the history too heavily. The attack sequence, however, was frequently recognized as a major technical achievement. This created a strange reputation for the movie. It could simultaneously be regarded as an impressive blockbuster and a flawed historical drama. That contradiction affected how people discussed its financial success. Supporters could point to the hundreds of millions earned worldwide. Critics could point to the enormous production and marketing costs and argue that the film did not become the cultural sensation its campaign suggested it might. The movie's release strategy also mattered. Pearl Harbor was positioned as a major summer event. Summer is one of the most competitive periods of the theatrical calendar. When Pearl Harbor was released in 2001, it entered a very different fan culture from the one that exists today. Social media platforms such as Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and Reddit did not yet exist. YouTube had not been created. Smartphones were not part of everyday life. Online fandom was already growing, but it was centered around personal websites, message boards, fan forums, email groups, internet chat rooms, movie websites, and early discussion communities. This is important when discussing the fan community surrounding Pearl Harbor because the movie's audience was never simply one unified group. Different people connected with different parts of the film. Some viewers were primarily interested in the historical setting. Some were attracted by the romance between Rafe, Evelyn, and Danny. Some were fans of Michael Bay's action filmmaking. Some were interested in the aircraft and military equipment. Some connected with the soundtrack. Others were simply fascinated by the spectacle of the Pearl Harbor attack. As a result, Pearl Harbor developed a complicated type of fandom. It did not become a traditional franchise fandom with an enormous mythology, sequels, collectible characters, and a continuous stream of new stories. Instead, its audience was divided among several overlapping communities. This distinction is important. A film can have millions of fans without developing a formal fandom structure. Pearl Harbor is an example of that. Its audience has often existed through individual emotional attachment rather than through a single organized community. The first major wave of fan interest came before the movie was released. The marketing campaign generated enormous curiosity. Trailers emphasized the scale of the production, the romance, the stars, and the attack sequence. The movie was presented as one of the major cinematic events of the year. This created anticipation among people who had not yet seen it. The internet of the early 2000s played an increasingly important role in this process. Fans could visit movie websites, read interviews, participate in message board discussions, download images, discuss trailers, and exchange opinions. This was an early form of digital fandom. The experience was much slower than modern social media. People had to deliberately seek out communities. There was no algorithm constantly delivering Pearl Harbor content to them. Someone who wanted to discuss the film usually had to find a website or forum dedicated to movies, historical cinema, Michael Bay, one of the actors, or romantic dramas. This meant that early fandom was often more specialized. People who invested time in finding these communities were usually particularly interested in the subject. One of the strongest fan communities developed around the actors. Ben Affleck was already a major celebrity by the time Pearl Harbor was released. His popularity had increased dramatically during the late 1990s. He was therefore an important reason audiences were interested in the film. Fans followed his career and discussed his performance as Rafe. Josh Hartnett also attracted significant attention. He was one of the young actors who became particularly recognizable around the beginning of the 2000s. His portrayal of Danny appealed to audiences who identified with the character's more reserved personality. Kate Beckinsale gained increased international recognition through the movie as well. Her performance as Evelyn helped introduce her to a much larger mainstream audience. This created another layer of fandom. People who became fans of these actors could encounter Pearl Harbor as part of their broader interest in their careers. For some viewers, the movie was therefore not an isolated experience. It became one film within the developing careers of three young stars. The romantic triangle was particularly important to fan discussions. Viewers often developed strong opinions about whether Evelyn should ultimately be with Rafe or Danny. This type of audience debate is a familiar feature of modern fandom, but it was already common in online communities during the early internet era. Fans could argue over characters' motivations, relationships, choices, and moral responsibilities. The emotional conflict between Rafe and Danny gave people plenty to debate. Was Rafe justified in pursuing Evelyn after returning from the war? Was Evelyn justified in falling in love with Danny? Was Danny betraying his best friend? Was Evelyn's decision understandable given that she believed Rafe was dead? These questions transformed the movie from a historical spectacle into a relationship drama. Different viewers could interpret the same events very differently. This is one of the reasons romantic elements are so powerful for fandom. Historical events may have established facts. Relationships invite personal interpretation. Fans can imagine alternatives. They can debate who is right. They can identify with one character more strongly than another. And they can imagine different endings. Pearl Harbor, therefore, generated a type of emotional fandom based on character relationships. Fan fiction was another potential extension of this interest. Early internet fan communities frequently produced unofficial stories exploring alternate romantic outcomes, missing scenes, character relationships, and hypothetical futures. Pearl Harbor's love triangle provided obvious material for this kind of creative engagement. Fans could imagine what would have happened if Rafe had returned earlier. They could explore what might have happened if Danny had survived. They could imagine Rafe and Evelyn's relationship continuing without Danny's death. They could also explore the friendship between Rafe and Danny before the events of the movie. These imagined possibilities are important because they show that fandom does not require the official story to provide every possible answer. Fans expand the narrative themselves. The movie's tragic ending also encouraged this. Danny's death creates a permanent emotional absence. Whenever a character dies near the end of a story, fans often ask what the story would have looked like if that character had survived. In Pearl Harbor, this question is particularly powerful because Danny is one of the three central characters. His death changes the entire relationship between Rafe and Evelyn. It also changes the future represented at the end of the movie. Because of this, discussions about Danny naturally lead to discussions about alternative endings. Another group of fans became interested in the historical aspect. More than 2 decades after its release, Pearl Harbor occupies a very different position in popular culture from the one it occupied in 2001. When the film first arrived in theaters, it was presented as one of the major cinematic events of the year. It had a huge budget, major stars, an internationally recognizable historical subject, an enormous marketing campaign, and the promise of spectacular action on a scale that audiences were expected to experience in theaters. Today, the film is generally remembered in a much more complicated way. It has not disappeared. It has not become completely forgotten. But it also has not achieved the universally respected status of a classic historical war film. Instead, Pearl Harbor exists in an unusual middle ground. It is remembered as a technically impressive blockbuster, a highly ambitious historical epic, a romantic melodrama, a controversial interpretation of history, and an unmistakable example of early 2000s Hollywood filmmaking. Its reputation has therefore changed rather than simply improved or declined. To understand that change, it is necessary to separate several different questions. How do people view the movie as entertainment? How do they view it as a war film? How do they view it as history? How do they view it as a romance? How do they view Michael Bay's filmmaking? And how does the movie look now that more than 20 years have passed since its release? The answers to those questions are not identical. One of the biggest changes is the way audiences understand Michael Bay himself. In 2001, Pearl Harbor arrived when Bay was already associated with spectacular action filmmaking, but his later career had not yet fully established the visual language that would become his trademark. Over the following decades, his reputation became much more defined. Audiences came to associate him with explosive action, rapid editing, elaborate camera movement, intense sound design, large-scale destruction, dramatic lighting, and an almost overwhelming commitment to visual spectacle. Because of this later reputation, modern viewers often watch Pearl Harbor differently. They do not necessarily see it simply as a historical war epic. They see it as a Michael Bay movie. That changes the expectations. A viewer familiar with Transformers and Bay's later action films may recognize Pearl Harbor as an earlier version of many techniques that would become even more pronounced in his subsequent work. The rapid movement of cameras around aircraft, the emphasis on explosions, the dramatic use of sunlight and lens effects, the large-scale destruction, the heightened emotional tone, the combination of action and romance. These characteristics are now easier to identify because audiences have decades of Bay's work to compare them with. As a result, Pearl Harbor has become part of the history of Michael Bay's filmmaking style. This is one way its reputation has changed. Another major change concerns the visual effects. When Pearl Harbor was released, the digital effects were regarded as an important part of the film spectacle. The filmmakers combined practical effects, miniatures, physical destruction, real aircraft work, and digital compositing to recreate the attack. Audiences in 2001 were seeing a technologically ambitious representation of Pearl Harbor. Today, viewers have become accustomed to much more advanced digital imagery. Modern blockbusters can create enormous environments almost entirely inside computers. Digital characters can be generated with extremely sophisticated rendering. Virtual production allows filmmakers to construct environments that would previously have required massive physical sets. Because of this technological progress, some of Pearl Harbor's effects can now look less seamless to modern audiences. But something interesting has happened. Rather than making the film irrelevant, the age of its effects has given it historical value. Modern viewers can now see the movie as an example of what large-scale visual effects looked like at the beginning of the 21st century. The practical elements can also seem increasingly valuable. There's a physical quality to many of the explosions, aircraft sequences, sets, and destruction effects. Even when digital effects are visible, the combination of physical and digital techniques gives the film a different texture from many modern productions. This can contribute to nostalgia. The movie becomes a snapshot of a particular technological moment. The same thing happens with the cinematography. Early 2000s blockbuster filmmaking had a distinctive visual character. Pearl Harbor contains many characteristics associated with that period. The image is polished and dramatic. The camera frequently moves. Light is used expressively. Action scenes are heavily designed. Romantic scenes are often highly idealized. Modern viewers may find some of these choices excessive. Others may find them nostalgic. This is an important distinction. What once seemed like cutting-edge spectacle can now appear unmistakably tied to its era. That does not necessarily make it worse. It simply gives it historical identity. The movie has become a period piece about an earlier period of filmmaking. This creates a fascinating double layer. Pearl Harbor is a movie about the 1940s that was made in 2001 and is now viewed from the 2020s. There are therefore three historical perspectives operating simultaneously. The first is the historical period depicted by the story. The second is the filmmaking culture that existed when the movie was produced. The third is the contemporary culture in which audiences are watching it today. Each perspective changes the interpretation. Another major part of the modern reassessment concerns the movie's treatment of history. This is probably the most controversial aspect of its reputation. Pearl Harbor is not a documentary. It is a fictionalized historical drama. The characters of Rafe, Danny, and Evelyn are fictional creations placed inside real historical circumstances. This distinction is important. The filmmakers were not attempting to reproduce every detail of the attack exactly as it happened. They were constructing a dramatic narrative. However, because the movie uses a real historical tragedy as its central event, audiences naturally expect some degree of historical responsibility. Modern viewers have become increasingly aware of the difference between historical drama and historical record.